felt it was really important to communicate with my guests and my customers. And, we have a pretty good loyal group of followers that I know are on Instagram, and just be honest and say, this is what's going on. This is how it's impacting us. And we have to pass a small portion of that impact onto you. And we're still taking it on the head a little bit, but we want to make sure our customers are aware of what's happening out there.
Welcome to The Profitable Table, fed by Wilco Foods, the nation's first podcast devoted to the business and lifestyle of the hospitality industry. Now, here's your host, Wilco Foods CEO, Stephen Toberoff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Profitable Table, fed by Wilco Foods. I am your host, Stephen Toberoff, and today I have my first repeat guest on the podcast, and it is Andrew Martino, who is the founder and owner of Ghost Truck Kitchen in Jersey City. And if you want to learn more about that particular restaurant and the innovations and everything, we're going to get into it a little bit, but I highly encourage you to listen to that episode. I think we're up to episode 55 now, and this was way back, maybe episode 6 or 7, but it's a great interview, and you'll learn a lot about Ghost Truck Kitchen, the concept behind it, and a lot of important things. The reason I invited Andrew on today to talk with me is because I consider him to be really a thought leader in the industry and one of the smartest people that I speak with in the industry. And there's so much going on right now that I felt it would be very beneficial for everybody to really get his insights into a number of the dynamics that are going on right now. So, Andrew, thanks a lot for taking the time to speak with me again.
Oh, it's nice to be back. Happy to chat.
So what prompted me to reach out to you is there's a number of different dynamics that are going on right now in the hospitality space, which are really unlike anything I've seen in my, 21, 22 years of doing this, from the accelerated ramp up to the labor issues to the inflation. And I saw you do an IG story, which I thought was terrific for a lot of different reasons, where you essentially communicated to your customers, your audience, that you were experiencing a substantial increase in your poultry pricing. And it led me to thinking, and it led me to call you. So I guess I just want to jump right into it and sort of get a big picture view on your part as to what are you seeing be some of the more challenging and macro dynamics that are hitting the hospitality industry right now as we come out of 2020?
Yeah, it's overall been obviously a very challenging 16 months for most restaurateurs. And it seemed like just as things were starting to roar back to life, we kind of got hit with something that I've never seen before, which is inflation on everything from proteins and meats to packaging to fryer oil to, dairy. I mean, there's really no reprieve any direction. It makes it hard to operate a restaurant profitably. I felt it was really important to communicate with my guests and my customers. And, we have a pretty good loyal group of followers that I know are on Instagram, and just be honest and say, this is what's going on. This is how it's impacting us. And we have to pass a small portion of that impact onto you. And we're still taking it on the head a little bit, but we want to make sure our customers are aware of what's happening out there.
Well, it's interesting because the same dynamic that you're experiencing, we're experiencing as well. I've never seen inflation like this in, for example, products such as soy oil and cooking oil, but there's many others. And I think some of this inflation is a byproduct of what I would consider to be transitory issues, which is some labor issues that'll resolve themselves, or because I think a lot of what's behind this, which is a very positive thing, is, and I had sort of envisioned this happening, is the hospitality industry, particularly where you and I are, Andrew, which is in the New York City, Jersey City, Hoboken area, has really come roaring back in a big way. And I think it's come back faster than a lot of people anticipated. So you had a lot of companies that cut down to the bone. And it's just not so easy to ramp up and get the staffing you need to accommodate that level of demand, which goes from 0 to 100 like that,
I think you are 100% correct. And I'll go one step further and say a lot of these restaurants perhaps gained as much as 50% capacity with outdoor dining restrictions being lifted or eliminated. So now you not only need to get to 100% capacity of what you had, you might actually need 125 or 150% staff capacity from what you ever had. So there's a lot of challenges that are presenting. And I do agree with the first point. It's only this way because vaccinations got rolled out so quickly to so many people that people felt comfortable traveling, dining, staying at hotels, booking airlines. Everybody is out and about all at the same time. And it's just a situation where the demand is really strongly outpacing the supply.
Now, back to the initial sort of point where I was sort of saying how we're facing the same thing and essentially trying to do what you're doing, which is, look, at some point I want to absorb, and I know you do as well, as much of the inflationary pressure as possible because we both value our customers tremendously. They've been loyal to us. They've stayed with us. But at the same time, there does come a point where you just have to pass it on. And I really appreciate your strategy, and I think it's going to be a winning strategy, and I'm doing the same thing. When I have customers, we get calls all the time, our sales team, about oil or for a while, and still is anything with resin in it. It's just letting them know point blank. And I've even gone so far to show people, look, this is what our distributors are charging. My question to you, Andrew, is do you feel that the feedback you're getting from your customers is, look, Andrew, we totally get it? Because I think up to this point, everybody's been super supportive of the hospitality industry, again, in the part of the country we are. But now they're seeing the inflation. Do you find that your customers are being receptive to your communication and tolerating it? How are you finding it in terms of their reaction to what's going on with price increases or other attributes of this inflation?
Yeah, but believe it or not, customers have actually been supportive. I received several messages of, thank you, wow, we had no idea, thank you for explaining, things of that. But I probably got 4 times the amount of messages from fellow restaurants, just bemoaning the same thing and thanking me for putting it out there. And now they're putting their own take out there to let consumers know what's going on. So yeah. I do feel like, yes, there's understanding, but people also still have mental limits on how much it should cost to buy a sandwich for lunch, right? How much I should spend on dinner. So, if I was raising prices like I should be, I would probably have a $16 grilled chicken sandwich that doesn't come with a side. And that's not a price that I would buy a chicken sandwich with in New Jersey, or in Jersey City. So, I understand that there are certain limits and I have to eat it for a little bit in the hopes that my customers will continue to be loyal and that things, as we get closer to September and people go back to work and demand subsides with summer ending, that, prices will hopefully adjust and come back closer to where they were.
Yep, I agree with your strategy, and it's essentially what I've focused on. I mean, in my space, Andrew, we have some competitors, I'm not going to mention them by name, and they're facing substantial challenges, primarily with staffing, but other things. And the way that they've addressed it is they're essentially making it less attractive for people to order from them. So, for example, they've cut their cutoff time for when you can get delivery the next day by several hours. They're charging an additional 10% surcharge on top of a split case item. So, when companies that do split cases of whatever the product is, those split items are always a little bit more money. They're putting a surcharge on top of it. And the strategy of a lot of these guys is, some of them I know from what my sales team have told me, they're not even out there soliciting, because they just can't handle the volume they have. So it's a truly crazy time. But I've made the decision, look, I want to pick up market share. I want to show gratitude to the people who stayed loyal with us. And we just have to absorb as much as we can within reason. Now, something that I'd like your opinion on, which for people who haven't listened to the original episode with Ghost Truck Kitchen, just to give a very basic explanation, Andrew's concept was to create a brick and mortar establishment that was solely focused on pickup and delivery. And this was pre-pandemic. So obviously he was truly a visionary, and obviously the dynamics that occurred over the past 15 months really enabled that. But as a byproduct of that decision, Andrew, even from the inception, you avoided a lot of the labor costs that most restaurants have to endure. I'm wondering what your thoughts are in that scope, even if it's not hitting your restaurant as well. I know you're very up on things. You'd mentioned the month of September, which is significant because it's when the enhanced unemployment ends. What are your thoughts about people who are thinking about getting into the hospitality space or looking for a job? When do you think that tipping point is when people actually get off the dime and start looking? Or how do you view that whole dynamic just in general?
Yeah, the labor has always been in the center of my mind. I spent 4 years in Southern California between 2012 and 2016. So California minimum wage was already high, and it was something that was a part, of all our discussions working in full service. So, part of the creation of Ghost Truck was really to, lower and eliminate a lot of overhead that I didn't feel was necessary for this operation. So we have been fortunate in that it only takes us about 4 to 5 people to run our operation, which is different from a full service restaurant that might take, 20, 30 or 40 people. As far as when people go back, I would say the smart people are starting to look right about now. If you're someone coming back into the workforce, this is a great time because you have some leverage. There are a lot of positions available. You might be able to pick and choose the employer that fits with your values or your schedule. I believe as we get closer and closer to that expanded unemployment ending, things are going to get pretty chaotic, and that hourglass is going to flip the exact opposite direction, where there's going to be a lot more people looking for jobs than jobs available. The summer is a great time. Kids are off. Businesses are booming. Things tend to slow down a little bit when schools restart. So a place that might be looking to hire 10 people now may only be looking to hire one person come September. So I really think, if you want the best employer, the most flexible hours, the most compensation, that should be taking place right now, today, tomorrow, Monday, whatever the case may be.
I completely agree with you. And I think that the people who really want to be in the hospitality space, and because people may not know this, but in the New York City area, there are many people who make their lifelong career as waiters, in addition to, of course, people that are chefs and others. And I think it's probably the best time ever for people to be seeking out their dream job and that dream dynamic in the hospitality space. And I think the people that are serious are going to start looking at it very quickly. One of the things that I had believed would occur in the midst of the past year when things were bleak was that the hospitality space would be, when this was over, would be elevated again, perhaps even more than ever, to the position of I don't want to say prominence, but we really now see how integral and important restaurants, nightclubs, bars, socializing are in people's lives. And so my question, sort of feeding off of that, is I think that I just, and it's actually, the timing is perfect. I just read in CNBC.com that even though retail spaces in New York City, commercial retail, is going down, more and more leases are being snapped up for these restaurants that are turnkey. And I'd like to know your thoughts, Andrew, as to whether or not you see a major renaissance rebirth happening in the hospitality space. Do you see the hospitality space being viewed any differently now than it was, say, in 2019? What's your sense on this whole thing?
I think what we're going to see more of is, I think that the break-in work for a lot of people that were really the backbone of restaurants, right? Whether those are line cooks, whether those are lead servers or lead bartenders or whatever the case may be, I think they realized that, they were working very hard and they were putting money in someone else's pocket, and maybe they want to work for themselves now or band together and start their own concept. So what I think we're going to see a new generation born from this of restaurateurs and entrepreneurs. And that doesn't mean they're all going to be successful, right? The majority probably may not be, but I do think there's going to be a new changing of the guard of people that want to cook their own food, that want to create their own concepts. There's many ways to do that. Yes, there's brick and mortar available, but I've seen really talented chefs from 11 Madison Park, launch brands on Instagram that have now become pop-ups that have become, brick and mortar. So there's a lot of directions for people to go. And I do believe that, there is a lot of talent, and people are going to take that talent and try to, be their own boss and do something that they want to do, opposed to maybe work for a large restaurant.
I think you're right. And one of the things that I saw on 2 occasions was 2 restaurants. The owner of the restaurant just didn't want to deal with it, and he sold it to his staff. And now these restaurants are flourishing, which is great. So I think you're right. I think there's going to be a whole new generation of people who come into the space. I also think that, pre-2020, one of the biggest challenges that restaurants faced in New York City is the lease, the rent. When the lease was up, many great restaurants that did a ton of business could not afford the lease. And I think that dynamic has changed and perhaps will stay changed for enough of a time for there to be this infusion of new chefs and new concepts that are taking advantage of the opportunity to finally open a space without having to take on rent, which from the very jump is risky. I saw this happen in 2008 and 9. I think that may be happening now. What do you think? Now everybody's going through these transitions in life. There's the great resignation going on. Do you think we're also going to just see a whole crop of new people that have always wanted to try their hand in this space come into this space?
Yes, but I'm not as confident as you that the landlords and the price is going to be dropping substantially enough that it's going to bring demand from this new generation. I think privately owned buildings may be a different story, but a lot of these spaces are owned by, larger companies, larger corporations. And if they have to sit vacant for 6 months or 12 months, that's really okay by them. And they want the rent that they're going to get. Outside of New York, I am definitely hopeful that there's a lot of new entrepreneurs out there. There's a lot of different ways to make money in food and beverage, not just restaurants, but consumer packaged goods and sauces and desserts. And I do think there is a real hunger for entrepreneurship in hospitality and the culinary field. So I'm always checking out to see who's going to come up with something cool and ingenious. And I hope these people and landlords will find a way to work alongside these young entrepreneurs and help them get off the ground. It's a challenging endeavor for at least 2 to 3 years for every restaurant. No one is gangbusters out the door unless you're very, very lucky. So I hope that landlords will help these guys get off the ground and get started.
Well, you said something interesting in your answer that I wanted to explore a little further, which is it's always been the case to a certain degree that there have been landlords that have been willing to, and in some cases desirous of, creating a dynamic where they and the tenant are in partnership together, whereby the tenant might pay a market rent or a below market rent, and then there's profit sharing. This happens in hotels, but it's happened in other things. Now, during the past year, something very consequential occurred, which is that there was a freeze on paying rent in New York City, and I don't know if it was in Jersey City, you could tell me. And so those landlords that were strictly tied to their tenant by the lease had essentially no legal recourse to pursue their back rent. And I have further ideas, or not ideas, but questions on this I want to explore with you after. But nonetheless, those people that just had tenants, they have not been able to do anything. Whereas those landlords who had a sort of hybrid relationship, they are still in business with the restaurant. Do you think that this experience where landlords were essentially prohibited from enforcing their right to collect rent will encourage more and more of those hybrid engagements? And if so, do you think that's a good thing?
Short answer, yes and yes. I myself have been part of several conversations where a sales-based or a revenue-based lease has been the way that they wanted to approach it. And that's not just in New York City. That's down south as Red Bank, New Jersey, where, I think people realize that interests need to be aligned and landlords need to align themselves with the restaurants and restaurants with the landlords. There's no better provider of real estate value than a great restaurant in your neighborhood. And I think restaurateurs are now more acutely aware of that. And I think landlords are more acutely aware of that. And it makes sense for landlords to, whether they're making an investment in the space or in the build out, I think it makes complete sense. And I definitely think we will see more of it. Again, especially a new generation of real estate and developers. I think that, maybe are in their late 30s and early 40s and see that there's a changing of the guard and they're starting to invest alongside potential F&B concepts or F&B groups. I definitely see that happening.
I completely agree with that. I actually think this is going to be ultimately a very positive thing for those independent restaurants that really have a great concept. Because as I was saying, the number of people who have had to close up shop simply because they couldn't afford the lease renewal was very much material. And I think when the landlord and the restaurant can have their interests aligned, it really creates the foundation for people to have a lot more security in going into this business because they know it's something that can be around for decade after decade. I haven't explored this. I don't really plan on exploring it. I'm wondering if you know, is that back rent that has not been paid still owed? Or is that going to just be absolved, or is that being done on a case-by-case basis? Do you have any insight or knowledge on that?
I don't have enough that I'd feel confident to say it's going to be one way or another. I do know specific cases where the back rent has been tacked on to the end of the lease, meaning like essentially they just extended the lease and added additional rent to all of the months on the remaining months of the lease. I also know there's cases where it is being absolved completely. I think it really depends on who your landlord is and what the situation is for the space.
What I would say to those listeners who have restaurants in New York, I did an episode several months ago with Jasmine Moy, who's a prominent attorney in the space, and we'd gone over some ideas, and she had somewhat different views than I did. But what I would suggest if you have a restaurant and you're in that position is now is the time to really talk with your landlord, and if they're reasonable, and I think that they have every incentive to be, work something out that works for you. Because at the end of the day, regardless of what is going on and regardless of how great things are, commercial rent is still going down in New York. And we both know that e-commerce was taking a toll on retail way before 2020. So restaurants are one of the more core and established concepts that will rent commercial space. And so if you have a good concept and you're making money and you're profitable and it's sustainable, the landlord has every incentive to work something out with you. And of course, it's neighborhood dependent, but something to do. And I think for those people who are thinking about just getting into the space, my personal view is, if I was getting into the space, I think, and I'd like to know your thoughts since you've had these conversations, I like the idea of the hybrid relationship more than the standard lease. And of course, it's all dependent on the terms and the percentages. Do you have a thought on that in terms of if you have a preference and what your thoughts are?
Yeah, I think, it depends a lot, of course, on your concept. I think it could potentially mitigate some of your risk and downside, especially if you're putting in a lot of capital to open up a place. If you're investing, $1 to $2 million to build out, furnish your space, get everything going. Yeah, you want a landlord that is going to work with you, that's going to help you stay there for a long time. If you're doing something on a smaller scale that maybe you think, has a chance to do well on its own and you're not totally out of pocket, maybe it's a different approach. But I do think the risk factor plays a lot into it. And again, I think more people will be willing to get into the business, put their money into the business if they feel confident that they have a good working relationship with the landlord and all of their goals are aligned.
Now, something I'd also like to explore with you is that, and again, this is sort of regional, but it really isn't that regional because I think it's going on in any number of iterations around the country. But I would argue that New York City and Jersey City are both going through major transformations of a different kind. I would characterize New York's transformation into being one where prior to the past year, New York was really ultra expensive. You had lots of people that lived there part-time. You had more and more restaurant groups and chains coming in that just didn't care what they paid, and the pricing was insane. And I believe what's happening in New York is it's becoming again, and I was born in New York and I lived there in 70s and 80s, so I've seen the trajectory. It's my view that New York is becoming once again a grittier, somewhat more affordable city, somewhat more artistic-oriented city, and definitely something more of a party city. And that transformation, I think, is going to play out in terms of what types of businesses open up in the hospitality space. In Jersey City is becoming much more established and viable in the entire city, not just the waterfront. You have the science and the tech campus opening up not too far from where we are. You have all kinds of development going on. I'd like to know what your thoughts are about the future of both of those locations. If you agree with me, you disagree, what's your sense? Because I think as these two areas evolve, and as I said, you could look at the look at any part of the country, everything's always evolving. It's going to impact what the hospitality space looks like. So I'm curious if you agree with me, you disagree with me, what do you think?
Yeah, I think when we talk about New York City, I think it's unfair to blanket it because I do feel that Manhattan is a very different animal from different boroughs. I would love to agree with you on what you think about New York City, but unfortunately, I don't see the residential prices dropping much, which will impact the people that can live there full time and patronize all these smaller restaurants. So I'm not as bullish that grittier, more artistic, back to kind of the way that the city used to be in the 90s is going to come back just because I think the price of living has remained very, very high. Jersey City, I feel I love that I'm here. I love that I live here. I love that my business is here. I think the city is scratching the surface on, what is going to become for, the next 10 or 15 years. I think there's tons of opportunities in all different parts of the city for people to establish businesses, live, move. I'm very excited about SciTech City. There's a big project coming for the movie industry that's going to bring a lot of business to Jersey City. So definitely feel very strongly about the growth of New York City and the trajectory. I think Manhattan is tough sledding, a lot of international buyers, part-time livers, very still high-end, ultra-wealthy. And what you have in the outer boroughs is probably closer to what Manhattan used to be 20 to 30 years ago, where there are a lot of opportunities. There's places to open up great restaurants that can anchor future neighborhoods, affordable places to live, affordable places to open up a business. So I feel, that the growth of New York City and the boroughs is going to continue. People are going to continue to be entrepreneurs there. But I do think that it does become much more challenging in Manhattan just from a perspective and also to build up a loyal and local clientele because, that's kind of left the neighborhoods is that a feeling of regulars and locals and people that would live in the same apartment for 10, 15, and 20 years.
Now, one of the things, well, I get what you're coming from. And listen, I'm looking, for example, there was an article in the Post where in the area of the Lower East Side by Orchard and Stanton, every night at 3 or 4 in the morning, people are coming out and partying. Obviously, it's being taken perhaps to an extreme in certain parts where it's getting, dangerous and whatnot. But I'm just seeing a level of partying and younger people and all of that than I've seen in a while, but perhaps it's just a snapshot, perhaps it's brief. I agree with everything you're saying about Jersey City. Do you think Jersey City is almost now in everybody's minds? Do you think it's, because I notice more and more frequently, there'll be articles in Eater NY that mention Jersey City restaurants. Do you think Jersey City has now evolved to a place where it really is viewed as an extension of New York City the same way the other boroughs are?
Close. I think we're very, very close. I think the pandemic actually accelerated that, especially during the time when indoor dining was not allowed at all in New York City. There was a lot of New York City residents that were coming across the river to go out to dinner and hang out. There was an influx of people that moved from New York City to the Jersey City region. So I do think it's getting to the point where it does feel more like a sixth borough, an extension of New York City. I think it'll continue to move in that direction.
One of the dynamics that I saw over the past year with a number of our restaurants is one great example, a guest of mine, Home Freit, who has 2 locations. At the time, he had the one in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And what he found is that because people were home, a lot of his customers who would go there after work, because they were working from home, they were now getting delivery and takeout for lunch. And he found his business was positively impacted by that. Obviously, the office worker situation is very much in flux, and I think that it was possibly in flux even before what we had the last year. But my question to you is, Andrew, let's assume that the office work situation comes back to, I'm just going to put a number out there, 30 or 40% of what it was, or even 50. Can that in and of itself create opportunities for certain restaurants that are living in more residential areas? Because it's like this, like if you work all day and then you got to commute home and you've been through the grind, then you just say, you know what, I just want to order up and watch some Netflix or chill. But if you've been home all day working from home, then you want to get out when your work's done, right? and you want to go out, and then it's not a grind anymore because you've been at home all day. So how do you see that sort of reversal playing out? Because it's going to be a dynamic to one extent or another. We just don't know how extreme. But how do you think that's going to play out and impact the hospitality space?
It's really hard to tell. My best guess is that people are going to venture out of their home for their lunch break as, okay, I've been stuck in my apartment, staring at my screen. Now I want to go out. But they're not going out to eat something. They're probably going out, walk somewhere. They want something convenient they could pick up fairly quickly, order it ahead of time. So I still think the convenience and technology aspect is still going to play. And there are a lot of tech companies and food tech companies that are working on solutions for the office worker, for people that are coming back to the office. So, anytime there's opportunity, there's always going to be smart people that are motivated to solve a need. So I think that that's going to happen probably quicker in New York than anywhere else because it's such a competitive market. But I agree with you. I think I read something actually about earlier dinner times. I think that's something very interesting to think about, right? People now might be who are 8 o'clock dinner people may now be eating at 6 o'clock. People might want to start their happy hour at 3 p.m. instead of 5 p.m. So I think there are certain behavioral things that have changed somewhat permanently.
I'm hearing that from a lot of our restaurants. I was just talking to someone the other day who said the same thing, that even though now there are places that are open till 4 a.m. in New York, and this guy has a nice gastropub, he's finding that the early dinner dynamic is still there. Like people got conditioned to do that.
Yeah. And it's different, right? Just like you said, instead of maybe you finish up at the office between 5 and 6, you get home, you're sweaty on the subway, okay, by the time you do what you want to do, you shower. All right, now maybe you're having dinner at 7:30, 8 o'clock. Now you work from home, you shut your computer off probably at 5 o'clock on the dot, maybe 5:30. And now you're ready to go do something and get back outside. So I think that's what you're finding is why, those times are kind of getting pushed back.
Now, one of the main issues in the restaurant space that you were on top of and seeking a solution for way before a lot of people was the third-party delivery apps and their fees and their negative impact on the restaurant space. I think a lot of people, and we discuss this for people who want sort of a deeper dive into that, please listen to our first interview because we go into the various strategies where these third-party delivery apps can work and where they can be absolutely disastrous. But the question I have for you right now, Andrew, is how do you see that space at the current moment and how do you see it evolving? I ask that because obviously New York City Council and perhaps Jersey City, you would know better than I, have put caps on what they can charge as fees. There have been a number of startups. There's been a lot of pushback against these guys. So how would you assess the state of the third-party delivery apps at this moment? And where do you see that evolving over the coming, let's call it 24 months?
Yeah, great question. Glad you brought it up. I think this is a very risky time for restaurants in their partnerships with these third-party apps. I say that because as we speak, a few of the major players have plans or have already enacted plans to launch their own brands, their own concepts, their own kitchens. And they're doing that and optimizing that by using the data that they've gleaned from us over the past 10 to 15 years. So every restaurant, I think, needs to make a plan of how they're going to protect their customers from getting poached to third parties, how they're going to keep their customer data in-house, and how, if anything, they're going to leverage third parties to help bring them customers that they can convert to their first-party customers. Over the next 2 years, I think you're going to see there's already been Uber consolidation, pardon my use of the Uber word, but there will continue to be more mass consolidation in the market. These guys will continue to vertically integrate with other major players, cutting out independent restaurants. And they're going to be able to offer bargain pricing because they're not all that concerned with profitability. They're concerned with market share. So, they're going to be able to undercut independent restaurants on pricing. This is why I'm glad you brought this up, have created a solution that we're about to launch in the coming months in Jersey City and in Hoboken. We're launching a hyper-local marketplace called Gold Coast Community Delivery, offering a very similar service to any of the major apps. The one big caveat being the restaurants themselves that are our partners are going to be the benefactors in profit sharing at the end of the day. So we've put together a tech stack and last mile delivery fulfillment, and plan on bringing on only independent restaurants and doing our own thing. Less fees for customers, less fees for restaurants, more transparency, more owning of your data. And that's really the only way I see locals being able to compete in the long run, is to form their own co-op style delivery networks.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing that you're doing. And as we discussed before, I mean, the bottom line is this. Clearly, when you have companies such as Uber or Grubhub or any of the big names that you mentioned, the ultimate end game was always very obvious to me, which is to the extent that they can generate and create the food and deliver that, that's going to, and you're right, these guys don't need to make money anyway, but it's going to increase their market share and it probably would put them in the position to be profitable. The
Yep.
question always was whether, would consumers be willing to do that if they knew it? But I think the most important aspect of this for independent restaurants to understand is that your brand is extremely important and valuable, whether you've built that brand as a brick and mortar, whether you've built it through people getting your delivery. You and I discussed, Andrew, delivery of meals in New York City was going on big time when I was a kid. 35
Right.
years ago. So this is nothing new. You'd call up. What made it different is it's done through a very slick, easy to use app. They can give you points. They can do this. So in addition to what you're saying, and I understand it's not as efficient, but I've been encouraging every independent restaurant, because it's much more affordable now and there's out-of-the-box solutions, to have your own mobile app. And I get it. It's hard to compete for real estate on people's phones. They're not going to do this for everything. But anything you can do to really make it a direct engagement between you and the customer you want to do. Because if you're relying on the third parties as the primary means of engagement with your customers, you're highly vulnerable. Some of these restaurants like the River Palm in Edgewater, for example, or Cheesecake Factory is another example, whatever you want to do. These are established brands that they're not going to be poached. They can use it if it's additional revenue, great. But if you're not in that position, you don't want to be at their mercy. You don't want to be dependent on that for your business's survival, because their interests are not necessarily in alignment with yours over the long term.
Not only are the interests not aligned in the long term, when you think about it, they're really not aligned in the short term, because they have to make both the customer and the restaurant happy. Who are they going to choose when push comes to shove and there's a disagreement or a dispute over a check and who's eating the refund? So there's already things that aren't aligned as far as it goes, and it's really only going to get much worse. So yes, my biggest pet peeve is when I see restaurants with DoorDash stickers and Grubhub stickers on their doors, and in their profile pictures it says, order delivery. You're giving your customers away. And what's going to happen is, the scariest line I heard this entire pandemic was, I asked someone what they had for dinner last night, and they said they had DoorDash. I said, well, what restaurant did you order from? They had no idea. They just know that they ordered from DoorDash. Oh, we get DoorDash all the time. DoorDash is not a restaurant. So that tells you the detachment that's happening between the customer and your brand. So you need to have a first party, whether it's an app, whether it's your own ordering website, whatever it is, something that you're in control of and you direct your customers towards.
Yep. And I think that, this is acutely the case in many other parts of America. In New York City, which is a walking city, and Jersey City is to an extent as well, the brick and mortar presence is impactful. But for these restaurants in other parts of America that don't have that traffic and they're really relying on delivery, you just have to be very careful and invest the time and energy for that brand awareness, and engagement. 100%. Yeah. Similar things have been attempted in my business as well. Anybody that can develop an app and leverage infrastructure that others have built and skim off the profits, it's a pretty neat business model, particularly if you don't have to be profitable. It's much easier to do because, again, kind of like what we were saying, the cool thing, if you want to call it cool, or the innovation of the third-party apps is you now have all different kinds of restaurants available, whereas when I was a kid, it might have been a dozen that would deliver to my area. So that's cool.
There is one more thing
Please.
I think we should touch on in the same vein,
yep,
which is the rise of virtual franchise brands that are operated out of independent restaurants. It's another buyer beware situation. I would advise restaurateurs to be very careful about giving access to all of your data to virtual franchise concepts that are selling you concepts, taking large cuts, but also forcing you to use one of their tablets, which gives them all of the insights into your current menu that they then use to develop more menus for other people in your area. So definitely beware of virtual restaurants that have catchy, SEOable, searchable names. Typically, the food is very poor in quality, and they are really, it's a cash grab. It's the Wild West right now for the virtual restaurant industry.
Right. And what I would say, and I've discussed this with prior guests, is look, if you're sophisticated enough, like for example, let's say I'm opening up a restaurant in Main Street, any town you want. And my concept is a hamburger place. But I notice that there's nowhere serving acai bowls and smoothies and things of that nature. And I know how to run my kitchen and leverage my fixed assets properly. Then by all means, create a virtual menu that'll accommodate that gap in the marketplace. But own that. In other words, if you're sophisticated enough to run a kitchen that's handling your brick and mortar needs, and you can then run a whole other concept out of it, I agree with you, Andrew. Why use some out-of-the-box brand? Yeah, you might make money. I haven't looked at the numbers. I know Mr. Beast, who big YouTuber, and many of these other people are doing these concepts, and I don't know the economics of it. But in my mind, what does make a lot of sense is if I know what I'm doing and I have a really great brick-and-mortar situation and I can leverage my fixed assets to offer one or two or three additional virtual menus that fill a gap, that to me makes a lot of sense.
Completely agree. Couldn't agree more. Five stars, double like. If you're going to put the time and effort to train your team on new items, it might as well be your brand and your items, and you get all the profits because you're doing all the work. So to use someone else's brand because they claim that they have, they're doing all this marketing for you and there's all this brand equity, there's not. There's no brand equity for virtual restaurants right now. One day that may change. One day you might be in California and can get the same virtual concept delivered to you in New York that you love, and it's the exact same and it tastes great. But that day is not here, and people should really just focus on their own operation, creating their own virtual brand if they need to, and just stop giving their data away and stop cooking food for other people because they're not doing any work and they're making more money than you are.
And also, we're at a moment in time now, back to what we were discussing before, where people really appreciate the importance in their lives of the local restaurants. People desperately missed being able to go to their local restaurant or bar and have a meal or have a drink. And so people love diversity, particularly if you're in a place like New York and Jersey City. Variety is the spice of life, as they say. So if you have that, really make the most of it and leverage every aspect of your brand. And the great thing about it is it doesn't have to be what other people are doing, and it doesn't have to be on such a broad scale. It could just be the 8 or 9 blocks where your restaurant is. You can have tons of people there. And if you've got a loyal base there, and then you build on that and have enough of a buzz going on where tourists might stop by every once in a while, or people recommend it to friends, build off of that. I had an interview with a guy that I did a few episodes ago, a restaurant consultant. He had some pretty good ideas. One of them was that every restaurant should have a QSR code in their window, which makes a lot of sense in New York City. And as people walk by, if they upload your QSR code and you give them some sort of incentive to come in, use your storefront. Use everything you can to engage with people, because that's what the ultimate benefit is to your brand,
100%. And I do have a QR code on the front of my store window, so I agree.
Yep, that's great. So, just to sort of button this up, because I really did want to speak with you, and we covered a lot of areas that I think are very important in the industry and what's going on right now. My own sense of things, God willing, is I think that we're in the early innings of a real sort of renaissance. But as occurred in 2008, what I think is going to be the most important theme, and this was important before, but I think it's more important than ever, is authenticity and humanity. There's always been different stages in the New York City restaurant space where you would have these grand, magnificent restaurants that it was all about the ambiance. Then other times you'd have really innovative, sort of off-the-wall cuisine, and that would be a trend. I think the trend now that's going to be here for a while is authenticity and humanity, because that was the connection that people were deprived of That's what they want. And that's what hospitality at the end of the day is all about. I'm curious if you agree with that, or if you think that there's another sort of trend or dynamic that's going to be driving this next sort of evolution as we go forward.
I agree with you. And I think this is maybe a generational thing. I'm in agreement with you. I think there's a generation now of foodies that are more concerned with the scene and the impression of what they're doing than the actual of what they're doing. So while I agree with you that authenticity, it matters for lasting brands, I do think that there is a younger generation that is seeking out trend, fad type things, just for the Insta or just for TikTok. Whether those are long-term successes, I'm not sure, but I know for me, definitely that rings true. That's what I want to be about, just relating to people on a person-to-person basis. But that doesn't work for every brand. So, be authentic in your own brand. And if you like doing bedazzled milkshakes on Instagram and, want to get 1 million views and go viral, I think there's room for that too.
You make a good point. I think that, I love social media as a commercial tool. I use it a lot as a way to engage with people, as a way to just what led to this interview. I was following you and I liked what you had to say and it prompted this. So I think it's a great tool for business. What people use it for personally, and I'm going to quote David Goggins here, not all the time, but a lot of the time, is to project this perfect life that they want people to see. And that's totally, that's human psychology. That's not something that we're here to talk about. But I think you make a great point, because at the end of the day, people know what's real and what isn't. And you make a great point. And it's important. Instagram, social media is so key. You want to have a few dishes on your menu that are really Instagram worthy, that are over the top, because people like to share and it's great advertising for you. But I was also saying, like, human to human connection is different than Zoom. And there's no better place to have that type of connection, I think, than a restaurant or a bar. And so if you leverage that with great food and a great vibe, again, you're right, everybody has to be true to their own concept. But I think that's something that we were deprived of and could be big. So, we'll see what happens. But listen, Andrew, and before, we wrap it up again, I really encourage everybody who hasn't listened to our initial interview to do it, because we get into a lot of subjects about takeout, delivery, what the restaurant of the future will look like, and we go into greater detail. And I think these themes are extraordinarily important right now, and there's a lot of value in that. So please check out that first interview. Andrew, I really enjoyed this. If you're in Jersey City, give us the address again.
We're at 356 Varick Street, the corner of Columbus and Varick.
And your Instagram is GTK, or?
We are at Hello GTK. You can also find us hellogtk.com. And we are on Twitter, rarely on Twitter, at hello_GTK.
Even if you're listening outside of Jersey City, I really recommend that you follow Ghost Truck Kitchen on Instagram, because Andrew often has some insights or some information there that transcends a region and is extremely helpful. So anyway, Andrew, I appreciate you making the time to do this, man. It's always great talking to you.
Absolutely. Pleasure's on my end. Thanks, Stephen.
All right. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. Please be sure to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. And to learn more about Woolco Foods or Stephen Toberoff, please visit us at woolcofoods.net.